Welcome to Under the Microscope. I'm your host, Jenny Germano. Thank you for joining me today. I'm excited for today's episode. We are going to be talking about licensing and launching cannabis cultivation facilities in a new emerging market. I'm going to give you a brief background about myself. I got my start in the cannabis industry in 2009 working in vertically integrated cannabis operations in Denver, Colorado. And then 2015, I founded my company, 𝗚cie Consulting Service. And I've been consulting nationally in the United States for the last 10 years. Please help me give a warm welcome to my guests today, Stuart Ware and Matt Best from Joywave Consulting. I'm going to go ahead and let them give you a little bit about their background and when they got into the cannabis industry. Stuart, why don't you go ahead and share with our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for having us today. So I got involved in the cannabis industry in 2013 and took a entry-level grower position at Medicine Man in Denver, Colorado. And it's a 40,000 square foot cultivation facility, and worked my way up to managing that facility and the day-to-day operations there. And then transitioned into working for a national cannabis consulting company where we helped people start cannabis cultivation operations all over the country. And we had a few international projects as well. Prior to starting Joywave with Matt. Matt worked with me at the national consultancy as well, prior to starting Joywave in the fall of 2020 together, co-founding Joywave. And yeah, we've just continued on with the work we were doing with the larger consultancy.
I love that. How about you, Matt?
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for having us. I just want to echo what Stuart said. We're appreciative of this opportunity. I moved to Denver, Colorado in 2008 and started to follow the cannabis industry closely. My family started a company in Denver called Medicine Man in 2009, one of the first fully licensed medical and eventually adult use cannabis companies in Colorado that started with commercial cultivation, as Stuart mentioned, operating within a 40,000 square foot facility, and then went on to open 4 dispensary locations in the Denver metro area. And so had a front row seat for that way into operations. And then in 2014, got involved full-time with consulting alongside Medicine Man. We would bring folks in from new and emerging markets to see what the Colorado marketplace looked like, what operations looked like, and did that for several years before co-founding Joywave Consulting in Denver in November of 2020 alongside Stuart, and have consult in emerging markets as it relates to license.
I'm really excited to have you both. Thank you for sharing. You both have such a deep and rich history in the cannabis industry. And I think your experience and what you're going to share with listeners are going to be extremely helpful, especially for those that are entering into a new emerging market. I'm going to start with licensing because that's where we all start. And I know that you do licensing across the United States, and that in every state that it's different, right? In every market, it's different. But we're focusing on the new emerging market today. One of the questions I wanted to ask is what are the common challenges that you think operators are faced with when they're actually applying for a cultivation license that you're seeing and experiencing in these new states that you're in?
Yeah, I'm happy to start there, Jimmy. Licensing, we've worked licensing projects probably over the last 10 years in over 30 US states. And what makes the process really interesting to me is that because of cannabis's scheduling federally, each state develops their own program for licensing and has their own rules and regulations, their own license application process. And although there are similarities between states, there's also differences between states, which makes the process unique and different in each market we work in. So with that said, it's difficult for new applicants or new operators, new entities to have a playbook, if you will, from how the last states have gone, because odds are their state is doing it unique and different from the other states, even neighboring states. And so that presents a challenge in and of itself, as you have to start from square one and really do your due diligence and homework on understanding the requirements of the license class that you're applying for. And folks who typically succeed in that environment are ones who are very familiar with the regulatory scheme. They're very familiar with the license application process, and they're able to often find and bring in outside assistance with folks like ourselves and others who have experience in this arena. And so to us, that said, regardless of how different each state handles it, the most common challenges that we see when applying for new licenses are fairly consistent. Those challenges tend to be, one, the requisite experience for the license class that they're applying for. And cultivation tends to be the license class where folks have to it's got the steepest learning curve. And so the requisite experience in a commercial cultivation setting can be difficult for new entities. They may have individuals with home grow backgrounds or small plant count grow backgrounds, but they often don't have folks who have deep commercial experience. So finding that and being able to represent that often presents a challenge for new operators. Another common challenge that we see is real estate, securing the correct real estate to park your license. And so obtaining the license is half of the challenge, but you also have to have a facility and infrastructure to operate within.
Yeah.
And the cannabis real estate gets really competitive really quickly because municipalities are restrictive on where they allow the zoning of cannabis properties. So this often forces a competitive environment to acquire existing buildings or parcels of land to develop for commercial cultivation or even micro or craft cultivation. And so real estate is something that we see groups have difficulty navigating just based on the competitive nature of acquiring and securing real estate, either through purchase or lease. And then I would say a third challenge tends to be financing. So
Yeah.
relative to other license classes, cultivation tends to have a higher cost of entry just due to the amount of total space required, the equipment required, and being appropriately financed for commercial license and the pursuit of commercial cultivation operations is a challenge that many folks underestimate. And so I would say, again, the three, just to summarize, would be prior experience with commercial cultivation, acquiring real estate that is suitable for commercial cultivation operations, and then having the appropriate financing in place to not only finance, but then build out in the setup of the operation, but actually have financing and money on hand to start your operations until you have some revenues.
Yeah, and I think the ones that you listed were perfect. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen in different states where maybe they have the two, like maybe they're doing good in those in two areas, but then have a grower that actually doesn't have commercial experience. Can you like briefly go over the different license types when it comes to cultivations?
Yeah, happy to weigh in there because it is different, like I mentioned earlier, state to state. And that presents a challenge, but it also presents an opportunity depending on your comfort level of getting into different tiers of commercial cultivation. And so we have seen it done under different structures. One, a more historical structure, I would say, was plant count driven, where you are licensed to cultivate and have control over a certain number of cannabis plants, both in an immature state or a vegetative state, as well as a flowering state or a more mature plant state. And as time's gone on, we've seen states shift that from plant count into canopy size
Yeah.
and breaking down license classes by, say, a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 or even tier 4 or 5 license classes. And that just typically follows a lower plant count or a lower canopy up to a higher plant count and a higher canopy. And they often break that up in our experience, maybe in 5 or 10,000 square foot increments, to where a tier 1 license may allow or permit for cultivation up to 10,000 square feet. And a tier 5 license may accommodate cultivation up to 40 or even 50,000 square feet of canopy, which when you think about that size, that is absolutely commercial scale.
Yeah.
And you're often managing hundreds or even thousands of cannabis plants in various states of growth. What is also more interesting and very emergent to us is a micro or craft license class, which we're excited about because it tends to favor smaller independent operators who are able to operate with lower plant counts or lower plant canopies in their facilities. And it really caters to a more craft type of operation. And we see that in the alcohol industry where you've got the big, large commercial brewers, and then you also have the craft brewers. Cannabis has some correlation in that regard,
Yeah.
where we're seeing an increase in micro and craft license classes that maybe are capped at 2,500 square feet of canopy or 5,000 square feet of canopy. The attractiveness of that is you don't need as much facility space, equipment, infrastructure to get in and participate in a legal adult use or medical marijuana market. And so that's a trend we've seen new states embrace. And some recent examples of that would be projects in New Jersey and Minnesota, where they have micro license classes that are great, in our opinion, for new entrants to the cannabis industry.
Yeah, it's just a lower barrier to entry for folks that want to get in. And
Yeah.
oftentimes with the correct guidance, you have more control over the plants because you are growing fewer plants in a smaller facility. You can be more hands-on with those. And we see oftentimes the end product is more of a craft, high-grade product.
It seems like craft cannabis is becoming a little bit more popular than it has in the recent years. Are you seeing more of the craft cannabis for people that are connoisseurs, or people just doing craft cannabis because they're not interested in doing the large scale?
I think it's a combination of both. I think consumers are becoming more discerning as time has gone on. And there was a time 10 or 15 years ago, Jenny, where any cannabis that was legally cultivated and made it to the market was acceptable to consumers. And now in 2025 and moving forward, I think we're seeing some separation in consumer preferences where there is still a large and healthy appetite for commercially grown cannabis that's coming out of these large cultivation facilities. But I think you're going to see more and more consumers who are educated on the type of product they want to interact with and the quality of the product they interact with, crave and seek out craft cannabis
Yeah.
that is grown in smaller batches with more hands-on approach and just tends to come out with higher quality. And it's no different than any other industry where you have large production of products and then hands-on craft production. I think that's going to be an ongoing trend where as folks get more familiar with this and understand the differences in quality, that they really seek out and gravitate towards a more craft product.
I would say, my gosh, I think consumers are learning. I think they're more educated now because we've had legal cannabis for at least a decade in some places. I think consumers have learned what quality cannabis looks like, what commercially grown quality cannabis looks like, tastes like, smells like. And
Correct.
I think they are able to discern as the market grows, consumers will become more and more educated when it comes to making purchase decisions.
I think there's room in the market for both. I think
Yeah.
there's room in the market for commercial cultivators that may produce a mid-grade product. It's just like Miller Lights, Bud Lights,
True.
mainstream beer out there that's at a very acceptable price range. And then you have craft brewers that sell a 6-pack of bottles for $22, but not everybody wants to pay $22 for a 6-pack of beer. So but there are connoisseurs that want to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As somebody who worked in a dispensary for so long and then helping clients launch dispensaries, there are always going to be people that have no problem coming in and buying the low tier or the mid grade or the popcorn or the shake, and they're okay with that. So it really just depends. Like you said, there's a lot of people who just like light beer.
To Matt's point also is just, we're excited about the smaller craft grow licenses because it does allow more people to get involved. And you don't have to have $50 million to start a commercial cultivation facility. You can start with much less, and it allows more people to get involved from a licensing standpoint. To bring the conversation back to licensing, is it allows more people to pursue those licenses and get involved in the industry.
Like you said, it makes it so where people who are really good growers who can't open a huge, massive commercial operation, that are gifted in growing and really know their stuff, it gives them the opportunity to come in this industry and hone their craft and share their gift of being able to grow that type of cannabis. To jump into the next piece, which is talking about facility planning and design. And Stuart, I wanted to talk to you about this a little bit. So once a license is in the hand, what is the first step in planning, getting ready and planning the build out for this cultivation facility?
So it depends on the market. I guess to Matt's point, it's different in each state. The licensing requirements are different. Oftentimes you're required to have real estate in tow at the time that you apply for the license. So you need to have real estate, whether that be raw land, whether it be a building you already own, or whether you acquire a letter of intent with a landlord that says, I agree to these terms. This is the type of lease I want to enter into with you guys if and when I achieve a license in this drawing or merit-based, whether it's a lottery or merit-based application. And so typically that's required in the licensing phase. But then once you get that license, you need to definitely secure that real estate, whether it's land or a letter of intent, and transition that into full-time lease or contract agreement with the landowner is the first step. And from there, you need to work with a designer to do the facility plans and lay out the facility. How big is the facility going to be? Is that driven by the license type that you applied for, or allowed to do whatever you want? And then you need to look at your budget. How much can your budget afford you? Is this a 3,000 square foot facility, a 10,000 square foot facility? And so start working through the design process and really digging into your budget and acquiring or gathering a team of qualified professionals such as consultants, designers, engineers, general contractors, things of that nature.
Another question I wanted to ask is, how do you balance compliance, scalability, and I know you talked a little bit about the budget, but the budget and the build out phase?
You know,
Specifically compliance too. That's a big one.
I know that's a big one for you. That's your favorite topic, but
It is.
it varies. So you obviously have the regulations you have to abide by for the state program, the regulations that were put in place. But then oftentimes people overlook the fact that there are local jurisdictions, whether that's a city, a township, a municipality, that also layers in their own regulations on top of that. So it can be a complicated, time-consuming process to weed through all those regulations and make sure that you're doing everything compliantly. And I think that's where professionals come in that have done this in over 30 states, like Matt said, that have seen almost everything they can throw at us. We have a client right now he was cruising right along, and then the city says, oh, okay, we need stormwater drainage. You have to build this big stormwater pond on your property. So he has a good sized property, and now they want him to use a half an acre of that for a stormwater pond, add in all these concrete stormwater drains. They want him to widen the road, which requires moving all the phone poles to the road. And he has to put in a 400-foot curb along the road. So things like that the city can throw in at the 11th hour and really put a kink in your plan.
That's a pretty big, expensive kink.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound cheap.
No.
Yeah. And those are impossible things to forecast from the onset of a project. And until you're engaged with your local officials, until they've had a chance to weigh in, and local officials are often reacting to state guidance. And I did want to add to that a bit, Jenny, as it relates to compliance. We used to see these programs be state driven and municipalities just have to follow state regulation. I would say as the industry's grown and evolved, we're now seeing the municipalities and townships and cities be more empowered to guide the zoning and facility compliance and design, if you will, and how it interacts with the water systems and the sewer systems and the power utility, et cetera. And so I would say the municipalities are more empowered now than ever, which is great because they can impart their preferences on the licensees and the operators in the industry. but it also comes at a cost of they're going through the learning curve at the same time you as a licensee or an applicant are going through the learning to be
Mhm.
compliant,
Yep.
how to develop facilities. And sometimes there's not always great communication between the state or the municipality and the licensees. And I would say balancing compliance, really, you have to embrace state level compliance, but also engage and work with your local officials early and often so that you're not caught off guard with expensive surprises when you're building out your facility or trying to go through your inspections to get operational. It's a really important piece of the puzzle. And then another piece on scalability is biting off and purchasing, outfitting, launching operations in 10, 20, 30,000 square feet of cultivation is not only expensive, but time consuming. And so we often recommend to groups like phase your project, take this in phases and make sure you have proof of concept before you deploy all your capital into these facilities and into these operations. And looking through the lens of a phased approach often helps licensees navigate this in bite-sized pieces and turn on a percentage of their capacity before deploying all their capital and making sure the market is steady and stable enough to support expansion and support additional plant counts or canopy. So it's always wise to maybe have a full look at where you'd like to grow to, but start small, build out a portion of your facility, staff it, begin producing revenue, gauge where the market is, and then take on phase 2 or 3 of your build out and operations. And I think that's really good advice for new folks that are looking at emerging markets. And the last piece I would offer up on the budget side is it's like designing a house. If you just let the designers and architects and engineers and general contractors do what they want, you're going to end up over budget really
Oh,
quickly.
100%.
And we can't stress it enough that going through some level of order of magnitude budgeting, or OM budgeting as we call it, is going to help you hone in much more specifically on what you can expect to spend for your build out and your equipment, and then reserving capital for your operational phase. And that just says, hey, if we lay out this, let's just say 10,000 square feet of space conceptually, what would that cost to build out and equip and operate? And groups who can invest a little bit of capital, you can get to those answers very quickly in your planning process so that you have a benchmark to work back against once you start making decisions. And so I think all 3 of those things help inform and educate, help groups make better decisions. Because if you just blindly go into it, it can get real expensive real quickly. And sometimes groups are unprepared for that.
And I guess to build on that just a little bit is there are very specific elements that can make or break a cultivation facility. And Matt and I have seen tons of them over the years going into facilities that are asking for help or not getting the yields that they want. And you walk in and you realize that this facility was just built out maybe on a shoestring budget. But what we really stress is in order to grow high quality cannabis, you need to put the money in the right places. And that's the equipment, the lighting, the HVAC or environmental controls, the type of materials you use to build out the grow rooms themselves to be as energy efficient as possible to keep your power bills low. Those are the types of things that you really need to not skimp on. Sometimes you get a curveball where you don't have enough power at the facility or on the plot of land that you already own. And there can be lead times of up to a year sometimes to get power brought to that site or upgraded to that site. And the costs associated with that can be astronomical. So there are costs that come up along the way. No 2 projects are the same. There are costs that come up along the way that can surprise you, but investing in the equipment and the environmental controls and making sure that you have your room sized properly and things of that nature is where you really need to focus your investment.
I actually wrote down curveballs because I'm always talking about that. And you guys gave a great example of a curveball for somebody who's building out a cultivation facility. That was wild what you shared. And I'm never surprised because the industry is full of curveballs. And so I think it is important that people are prepared and getting heavily involved. And also, too, I like what you said about the phased approach. I think that's really important because I think people get overwhelmed, and I think the phased approach is easier for operators to digest. I think it's really good advice.
Yeah, and it's different that doesn't really apply to a dispensary, right? Like a
Sure.
dispensary is going to build out their entire footprint and be ready to operate day one. And that makes sense if you think about it from a retail standpoint. But with commercial cultivation in particular, we're talking typically about tens of thousands of square feet of plant canopy and an even larger building footprint to accommodate that plant canopy. And just the upfront investment to build all that out and start operating all that, it's seriously labor intensive. It's seriously capital intensive. And sometimes groups overextend themselves to pull that off, if you will. And we've just seen much better success in the mid and long term for companies who phase that and take it in bite-sized chunks, generate some revenue, and use that to fuel their phase 2 or phase 3 growth. Tends to be a much more stable and steadier mid and long-term plan for cultivators in particular.
Yeah, I think too often people see this as the cannabis industry. They lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, this is a manufacturing company. As a
Yeah.
cannabis cultivation facility, and a facility that size, you've got to bring on 40, 50 employees all at the same time. You need HR, you need all the things that a regular business needs. And that's where sometimes people just overlook the minutia that is required to launch a large facility at scale.
Speaking of minutia, I want to jump into money. And so, Stuart, what are you seeing out there? Where are people getting the money to start these businesses?
Yeah, the majority of our clients have been successful in business in other arenas. So a lot of them are bringing their own capital and maybe some partners' capital to the table to work with. Some go out and do financial raises or some stock issuance, things of that nature, to allow smaller investors to get involved with the project. But I would argue the majority of it is self-financed. And I think something that people forget is if you're building a new building or buying a plot of land and building a building on it, that's traditional real estate. You can do that. Just like I know federally cannabis is illegal, so banks don't typically loan to cannabis companies like
Yeah.
they would traditionally to a regular business. But you can still get a loan to build a building through a bank traditionally. And then it's only once you get involved in the interior build out and all the electrical and buying all the HVAC and lighting and things of that nature where you really need to have the capital on hand to be able to finance the project.
Quick question. You can just give me a somewhat close number. You don't have to be exact, but what's it cost to build and grow in 2025?
Oh gosh. 10 years ago, we used to tell people like $200 a square foot.
Oh my
And
gosh.
during COVID, we saw those prices go way up and we saw lead times get out of control. The lead times have come down. The prices have not come down as much. So to reference Matt's comment about building a house, you can build a house with laminate floors and bare bones, or you can build a house with marble floors and gold faucets. So it just depends on how crazy you want to get with it. We've seen projects go as high as $600 a square foot to build out
Wow.
a cultivation facility.
I think Stuart brings up a great point. There's a lot of preference that goes in there. And I think folks go into this process with their eyes wide open and end up scaling back as they get closer to the true cost of build out. But I think from recent projects that we've done, Jenny, efficiently planned, the right equipment, environmental controls, et cetera, we still feel commercial size and scale facility can be built out and finished, hopefully closer to $300 a square foot. To Stuart's point, we've seen it go much higher than that, but with higher comes more nice to haves, more amenities, more automation in your facility and your infrastructure. And that's what the premium price is paying for. You're paying upfront to replace some ongoing labor costs through automated systems, automated controls. And that's great. And it might be appropriate for some groups. But if you're a micro cultivator working with a lower budget for your project, you can still be hands-on in a lot of your cultivation operations, whether it be hand watering and hand feeding, whether it be through hand trimming your product. There's ways to stay hands-on and not automate so much of this, which certainly brings down the cost to build out and equip a new commercial cultivation facility. But again, some of this is driven by where they're located in the country. Some of this is driven by the cost to acquire real
Yeah.
estate, which varies greatly, whether you're in Mississippi or you're in New Jersey or California, for example. So those are external things that are going to influence each project. But I think from a good round number basis, low end 200 to 300 a square foot would be a good target. High end, probably closer to 400 or 500 per square foot. And that's inclusive of everything: grow rooms, equipment, HVAC, lighting, fertigation, irrigation, etc. So that is a fully loaded cost. But when you run that out over thousands or tens of thousands of square feet, you can see how those numbers add up pretty quickly.
Part of it depends on the real estate that you acquire as well. So Matt brought up Mississippi, and we had a client that acquired a huge facility in Mississippi that had been vacant for years and didn't realize how much investment needed to go into the building just to get it ready to even be built out as a cultivation facility. The entire roof needed to be redone, foundation issues, loading dock issues. It was $700,000-800,000 worth of work that needed to be done to the building to even have a good shell to start with.
Wow.
And we've seen other clients that get into facilities that they were used for another application in a previous life, and it's just riddled with all kinds of rooms that don't work with what we're trying to do, and demolition costs come into play, and how you restructure that facility comes into place. Like I said before, no two projects are the same, and I think having experts on board prior to acquiring real estate is a good idea, because we've had other clients that said they're so proud of themselves and they're like, wow, we got a great deal on this piece of rural property way out in the middle of nowhere, and we stole the property. And then you find out it's going to take $1 million. They got to pay for 375 power lines or power poles, and it's going to cost $1 million to get power to that property. That wasn't such a good deal after all.
Yeah, those are some really good lessons. And since we are talking about construction too, what should operators absolutely not overlook during their build out?
I want to add one more thing to the
Sure,
last
go
point,
ahead.
Jenny, was a lot of what we're discussing in this moment, it relates to indoor controlled environment,
Yeah,
commercial
it's good to bring up.
cultivation. So that's where you're going to pay a premium for your facility and your infrastructure. Cannabis, as we all know on this call, can be grown in the ground under the sun for a lot less money, or it can be brought into a greenhouse, or it can be brought all the way into a controlled environment warehouse. I should also caveat that some states allow for outdoor cultivation and allow for greenhouse growing. Now, it depends on where you're located in the United States, whether or not that may be an effective growth strategy to produce high quality product, but it is possible. And so a lot of our conversation, at least to this point, has been geared towards indoor cultivation, because that's where you can cultivate the highest quality product. And where markets tend to gravitate towards as time goes on. So we're doing work in New York right now, and New York was built on an outdoor grow market. But as it becomes more competitive, as consumers become more discerning, they often tend to seek out higher quality products, and the highest quality is grown indoors. And so that's just important. I feel some context to our conversation today and some of the costs and some of the realities we're talking about. Stuart and I primarily consult on indoor controlled environment commercial cannabis cultivation, because that helps mitigate your risk. It helps mitigate your variables in your process. And that's why you're able to achieve the highest quality. So I wanted to mention that for your listeners, just because there may be folks out there who tend to grow outdoors or greenhouses, and their costs are going to be much less. They're going to face higher risk as it relates to their environments and their process, just based on some of those variables imparted by Mother Nature and the sun and the water quality in those areas and all those things. As it relates to construction and compliance with that, I really feel as time has gone on that coordinating with your municipal officials early and often, not just for zoning and making sure your facility is stood up in the right part of town or the right part of the community, but engaging your local utility, who's going to supply power and telecommunications to the site, engaging with the local water department, not only for supply side water, but wastewater and how wastewater is managed in and out of a commercial cultivation facility, is increasingly important because they tend to be the gatekeepers from a compliance standpoint, and they're the ones setting the threshold for your allowable wastewater and how they want it treated and how they want it directed out in and out of the facility. And so I just think that all of those folks are really important in making sure you navigate that successfully in order to have a successful and profitable commercial cultivation operation.
Yeah, that was really well said. And I'm glad you provided context that we're talking about indoor and how outdoor is different, greenhouse is different. I think that's really important to differentiate that in the conversation.
To add a little bit onto that, unfortunately, the states vote on legalizing cannabis. The regulations are put into place, and then it's dropped into the cities, municipalities, townships lap, and it's okay, you guys run with this. And so oftentimes they're ill prepared and they don't know how to regulate this, and their fire departments have never inspected a cannabis facility, and their water companies have never even thought about water runoff coming from a cannabis facility. It takes them time to start regulating that. So as you're doing your build out, oftentimes the city hasn't even implemented all the regulations that they're going to implement, which is another curveball.
Yeah. I swear, I feel like we could just actually put out a book just called Curveballs in the Cannabis Industry.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we talk to every single person in the industry, we could come up with 20,000 pages.
Yeah. I ultimately feel, Jenny, that's where groups rely on outside consultants like ourselves and you and others who've been in those local meetings, who've helped educate local officials and state officials as to best practice. And because sometimes they develop rules and regulations that are unachievable from a compliance standpoint with normal best practice and operations. And smart municipalities and smart licensees are able to educate themselves and the regulators with outside experts to help move that process along, because otherwise it can stall out pretty quickly. And so that's, I think, part of the value that outside experts bring to the entire process.
Yeah, I think sometimes too, these local municipalities are creating these rules, but they're not talking to all the other different agencies, like maybe the police department or the fire department or the water department. For example, I had an inspector come in and say, oh, you need to have a push bar, but it has to have a 4-second delay. And the fire department, you can't do that. That's a fire exit door. You can't have a delay on the door. I think it's really important that people are communicating on the local level when they're coming up with these rules and regulations, that everybody's on the same page or they have a better understanding of what's going on. And that kind of brings me to my next piece is equipment. What are the improvements that you guys have been at this a long time, the journey of equipment and from where it started to where you think it is now in 2025?
It's improved by leaps and bounds.
That's good.
So yeah, in 2013, the facility I started at in Denver, we had plywood rooms with window unit air conditioners.
Oh my gosh.
With plastic totes catching the runoff from the back of the condenser coils, and plywood built grow tables. And obviously there was a little better equipment back then than that, but it's part of it has been driven by the fire departments and code regulations and things that were not an issue back then, and they are an issue. So the way that some folks built out facilities 10, 12 years ago isn't even legal these days. But we've seen a lot of advancement in HVAC. Hopefully no more window unit air conditioners.
Oh man.
No more 5-ton residential carrier units. There have been companies that have really catered to the industry. They saw the potential in the industry, and they've purpose-built equipment for the cannabis industry. It's pretty rare to have indoor cultivation. So there's a lot of electronics. There's a lot of equipment. So it's kind of like a data center and an indoor swimming pool coming together. You got a bunch
Yeah.
of humidity, you've got a bunch of equipment running, you've got a lot of heat being produced by this equipment. You've got to deal with the heat, you got to deal with the humidity. It's a unique struggle. And so we traditionally, I would argue, most of the facilities that we started building out 10 years ago, we had decoupled systems just because there was not equipment that could suitably handle the environment. So decoupled equipment just meaning a 5-ton carrier unit that is just for cooling. And then you had dehumidifiers to handle the humidity. And they oftentimes fought with one another, trying to keep the temperature exactly right. And now with reheat coils and things of that nature, large manufacturers developed HVAC equipment that can handle the humidity as well as the temperature. The lighting has improved by leaps and bounds. 10 years ago, we were installing high pressure sodium and metal halide lights in all these rooms, which produced tons of heat. Now we've got LED lights. They started coming on the scene 9 years ago. They just weren't good. We were running side-by-side tests with them. The quality and quantity of product that you were achieving with the LED, with the first version of LED grow lights, it just wasn't there. But now it is. Over the last 8 years, have improved by leaps and bounds. And now they produce less heat, they use less energy. So I would say lighting and environmental controls have improved greatly.
Another thing I would add to that, Jenny, is the software and environmental monitoring, allowing cultivators, especially commercial cultivators, to make data-driven decisions in their operations. And back in the days where Stuart cut his teeth, you're walking in with a traditional thermostat on the wall that's telling you approximately what the temp and humidity is in the room. But that's not being fed into through software into a centralized monitoring environment that you can monitor remote, you can adjust remotely. We've seen such advancement in particular in that arena, and the software and environmental monitoring that allows you other environmental measurements that you're going to want to keep track of in your grow rooms. And it can be centralized and reported and adjusted remotely or on site. And that's just something that was uncommon or largely didn't exist 10, 11 years ago. That is, to us today, minimum viable to succeed commercially, especially in larger facilities where you've got multiple grow rooms, multiple ancillary spaces that you want to maintain in the perfect environment. Because if you can set and reach those environmental thresholds that you want to have set in your operations, you're going to have a much easier time succeeding in a cultivation operation versus those systems fighting one another or not communicating properly or not being able to be monitored, adjusted in real time. And so we could go on and on about emerging technology and some of the stuff that excites us. We've seen real improvements, and it does come at a cost, but that upfront cost reduces your risk downstream once you're operating. So there's a give and take there for sure.
And there's nothing, I think, more amazing than walking into a cultivation facility that is actually environmentally controlled correctly.
To build on that, the HVAC units these days, 10 years ago, we weren't talking about air exchanges in the room per hour. And now that's a big point of the conversation, is how quickly are you moving that air? How quickly are you cycling that air? How many times is it going over the coils to remove the humidity? Things of that nature. It's an involved conversation that these companies have taken very seriously, and they've grabbed the bull by the horns and they're running with it.
As you say, Stu, half the battle, it's not just the equipment and the reliance on the equipment, but it's the mechanical engineer who specs it and sizes it and quantifies it for your size and scale of operation. And now, not only do we have the equipment, has equipment made real leap over the last 5, 10, 15 years, Jenny? But the engineering has as well. So where now we have mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, plumbing engineers who specifically work for and with the cannabis industry. And they just did not have that requisite experience back in the day. And they were setting up operators for failure by improperly sizing equipment, or improperly placing equipment and underestimating the demand on this equipment, because these facilities operate 24/7, 365. You don't have days off in the garden. And a lot of the equipment
True.
wasn't designed to be run 24/7, 365. And we'd have breakdowns in pumps and coils and all these other different parts and pieces that would really throw a wrench into your cultivation process. And so now today, to have it not only be properly engineered, but be properly designed for commercial cultivation application is and was half the battle. And that's solving a lot of the problems that I would say we used to run into in these facilities.
That's a really great point, Matt. And we recently had a project where engineers were brought in because of a relationship they had with the client, and they had no cannabis experience. And when they spec'd the amount of HVAC and the amount of dehumidifiers they wanted in that room, it was unbelievable. It was the amount of dehumidifiers in addition to the HVAC that they wanted to install in this facility would have cost the client hundreds of thousands of dollars for that additional equipment. And I'm like, absolutely not. We can wire for those dehumidifiers, but we are not buying those dehumidifiers. We'll run the system and see if they're necessary. And sure enough, they're not necessary. If you don't know better, they would have been out hundreds of thousands of dollars.
True. Matt, I don't know if you can briefly talk about market strategy. I know none of us are marketing specialists, but we do understand the importance of having a marketing strategy and why that's important to the success of the cultivation facility.
Yeah, I think, Jenny, this is a great topic. And we see even our most seasoned, even our most prepared clients underestimate marketing and sales strategy for their business. I think there's this preconceived notion still in new markets that just because you can grow it, that it will automatically package itself,
No
walk itself
kidding.
out of your building, land on dispensary shelves, and be purchased without a problem. And you're going to sell 100% of what you grow. And they build performas and financial models off those revenues 4, 5, 6 months into operations where they're taking down their first crop. And they go, oh my gosh, who's going to sell this? Who's going to market this? It's not going to do it itself. It's the cannabis plant. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We really stress and really advise that to our clients, especially our larger commercial cultivators, to develop a robust marketing and sales strategy that can be measured and tracked and deployed like any other industry who has to sell products into a wholesale environment. Because if you don't, you're going to quickly accumulate inventory in your facilities. And not only does that take space, but it eats away at your revenue potential. And so I think having a well-defined sales strategy that's supported by software that's used in other industries,
Yep.
where you're signed up on wholesale exchanges, you have, of course, you need to still have the in-store presence with your retail dispensary partners. Of course, you still need sales managers throughout the state. Some states are bigger than others. Take our home state of Colorado. It takes hours to go from the Front Range in
It
Denver
does.
to get out to the Western Slope or to get up into the mountain communities. You've got weather that's impacting that. So we can't have people all over the place all the time hand selling this product to dispensaries. You have to rely on software, but it also, you have to invest in your brand. You have to invest in your collateral, in your marketing, in your advertising. And this industry is unique. You don't have access to all the media channels and the marketing channels that big brands in other CPG product categories have access to. We can't run TV ads oftentimes in a lot of markets. We can't run broadcast radio ads. You have to get creative. There's restrictions in social media, etc. My advice is to find a marketing firm or an ad agency or someone on the brand communication, brand strategy side who has experience in cannabis, who can help you develop your visual elements, your logos, your websites, your social media, and have some regularity in those channels, just like any other consumer brand would. Just because it's cannabis, it doesn't need to be marketed, doesn't mean it needs to be advertised. You still have to invest in those areas, and you have to be in front of that sales process and really embrace the investment into those channels. Otherwise, like I mentioned, you're quickly going to accumulate inventory and you're going to be wondering how long you can sustain that. And it's something that's really critical to your mid and long-term success in this industry.
Just to add to that a little bit, I think it gets amplified whenever you add manufacturing to the space. A lot of our clients are couple cultivation facility and manufacturing if the state allows for that. We have multiple clients, definitely over the last 10 years. We've had a ton of clients that have done both, and the marketing effort just gets amplified to the next level whenever you're doing both. I think too often clients, they don't understand the value of relationships with bud tenders, especially with smaller craft growers. If you're producing a premium product, it's great. You deal with the buyer at the dispensary, or if there's 5 dispensaries that have one buyer that does all the buying for them, that's great. You can work through pricing and work on product flow. But if you don't have a relationship with the bud tenders and the bud tenders don't like your product, I think that's something that so many clients overlook, is that relationship building and getting their feedback, whether that's product reviews. So you're giving samples and these bud tenders are getting to sample your product, but they need to fill out this quick 5-question review of your product. That gets them engaged, that gets them familiarized with your product. And if they like it and it's a good product, they're more likely to recommend that product.
Bud tenders, they go from dispensary to dispensary, and those bud tenders, they built relationships with those products or those cultivation facilities. And so they're very knowledgeable. So if they leave one dispensary and go to another, they're coming in with that knowledge and wrapping up. What are the top 3 mistakes that you guys are seeing happening?
Yeah, I think broadly, if you're entering this industry that's emerging market, you have to really define why you're doing it. And I think there's too often in my experience, I have a real passion for cannabis. I want it to be more widely accessible. I want it to be more socially accepted. I want it to be an alternative to the other recreational or adult use or medical products that people have access to. And I think folks who don't have a passion for it or don't define their why they're getting into it early in their project often find themselves overwhelmed not long into their journey, because they underestimate the fact that it is like other traditional industries. It just comes with an extra layer of compliance and regulation because of its scheduling federally and at the state level. And so the most successful groups we've helped work with through this process have a clearly defined why they're doing it. And that might be a personal story, that might be financially motivated. But defining that and using that as what motivates you each and every day, to me, is critical. And so I just encourage folks, especially in new markets, to define that for themselves before they invest a single dollar into this industry, because it's going to keep you on track and keep you heading towards your goals and objectives in the mid and long term much more effectively than just, hey, I see this as a new opportunity. It's a good way to make some money in this exciting new industry. That's not enough. You need more than that. So to me, that's critical and paramount, whether you're going to be a grower, a manufacturer, a retailer, or be vertically integrated. You've got to define that for yourself and your team, because that's what is the over projecting your revenue because you feel that you're going to sell through 100% of what you cultivate in these facilities is often a bit of a misconception for new operators. So doing your due diligence when you're in your business and your financial planning stage to play out different scenarios as it relates to your maybe scenario A, B, or C, where you can weather it economically and financially, because there's going to be external factors that come in. There's going to be more licensees that find their way in. There's going to be big established brands from other states that want to get into the action. And so I just think having realistic financial forecasts is something that benefits groups. And I still see a lot of groups overestimate for these operations.
We have commercial size clients, craft size. I think the craft size clients, it's easier for them to sell through. And that's part of the reason we love that. But when you have a commercial size client producing 250 pounds a week, every week, that product's coming, you've got to have a robust marketing and sales division to be able to get rid of that product, whether it's wholesaling to manufacturers for oils, for vape pens, for gummies, for other things, plus selling flower to the market. there's ways to handle that volume of product. It just becomes a bigger task. And I think even bigger than overestimating their sell through is underestimating the costs of entering the space. Oftentimes we have folks that reach out to us that are like, I've got $100,000 or $150,000. I want to build a 3,000 square foot grow. And folks oftentimes just underestimate the expense of into it. Matt and I take intro calls with clients all the time, or just folks that reach out to us on our website. And we're happy to talk folks through that and just update them on the realities of entering the space.
Yeah. The last thing we want to see happen is someone have a passion for this industry and a passion for the plant and some prior cultivation experience, just get sidetracked of entering and succeeding in this industry and losing that dream and letting it die on the vine because they're overwhelmed. And there's ways to get creative, and there's ways to succeed on lower budgets and eliminate some of the automation and the things we talked about earlier. I just hate to see instances where that's the outcome.
Yeah.
I'd rather folks be financially prepared, because financial health is just as important as mental health, physical health in this world. And knowing what's coming and making informed decisions because you're prepared financially is only going to help you be more successful in this space. And it's really important. Otherwise, like we've talked about, the project can become overwhelming, and it can become folks anticipated they were going to bite off.
Folks that can afford it in the cannabis space invest in the environmental control systems and the automated fertigation and things that remove the person or the hands-on activities. To a certain extent, there's still a lot of hands-on, tender loving care that's required for these plants. They're living organisms, but it's what can you afford? To Matt's point, there are ways to get into the space inexpensively, but it does require more hands-on time.
I would have to say that was jammed packed. So thank you guys. We have a lot of information in this episode. I just want to thank Stuart Ware and Matt Best from Joywave Consulting. And I really appreciate you guys being my guest. And I'm happy to know the both of you. I'm just really excited that you came on my podcast.
Thanks, Jenny. We appreciate you. We need more good folks like you helping folks in this industry, because that's truly what's most important, is folks who are passionate about the plant, who want to help people succeed and are willing to put in the time and effort. And I think that's why we've both stood the test of time, and hope to find groups who value that want to go on that journey with us. It's not for everyone. It's not for everyone, but for those with a real passion and some conviction and want to get their hands dirty, it can be a great industry and a great place to spend your time.
I second all that. And one to add, what mistakes folks make is they don't realize the level of compliance and regulation. And that's your Jenny. And I think you're extremely valuable to the industry and to these clients that are walking into this industry underestimating the amount of compliance that you have to deal with.
It's so true. Thank you both. And I just want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. For those listening, this podcast is going to be streaming on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. If you want to watch it, it's going to be on my YouTube channel, which is Under the Microscope with Jenny. So thanks again, everyone. I appreciate everyone listening and joining the podcast today. Thank you.
Thanks.